There was once a king and a queen, both of them died. The end. If someone had to describe the French Revolution in one line, this would be it. But of course, the story is far more complex, full of chaos, passion, blood, and ideas that changed the course of humanity. It's not just about a king losing his head, but about a world waking up from centuries of darkness. The French Revolution wasn't just a revolution. It was the birth of democracy as we know it, the moment when people realized they could challenge kings, question gods, and demand equality. To understand how this storm began, we must travel back to the 1600s, an era when kings and emperors ruled almost every inch of the earth. These rulers were obsessed with wars, each trying to prove they were the most powerful, the chosen ones of God. Europe was burning in the 30 Years' War, Africa bled through conflicts, China saw the Minqing battles, and India witnessed the endless Mughal-Maratha clashes. But while kings played their deadly games of power, the ordinary people, farmers, workers, and peasants were crushed under the weight of taxes, hunger, and blind obedience. Society back then was like a pyramid. On top were the aristocrats and nobles, the ones with palaces and titles. Below them stood the clergy, the so-called servants of God, and at the bottom, struggling to survive, were the peasants who made up most of the population. It was a world where one's birth decided one's destiny. The poor were told that their suffering was the will of God, that they should obey their masters, and that their misery was punishment for sins from past lives. Kings were seen as divine, chosen by God himself. The church made sure no one questioned this. The idea was simple: obey or burn in hell. But then something extraordinary happened. People began to think slowly, quietly, dangerously. This period came to be known as the Age of Enlightenment. Philosophers like René Descartes began asking questions that no one dared to ask before. "I think, therefore I am," he said, suggesting that human reason, not religion, defines existence. Scientists like Galileo and Newton shattered age-old beliefs of the church. Galileo proved that the earth revolved around the sun, not the other way around, and was punished with lifelong imprisonment. But his rebellion against blind faith lit a spark. Writers and philosophers began to challenge everything. Edward Herbert questioned religious miracles and the church's authority. He introduced deism, the belief that even if God existed, he didn't control human lives. John Locke went further, saying that every person is born equal and that no king has the right to rule without the consent of the governed. Rousseau declared man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. The chains, of course, were society, monarchy, and religion. And thus, the idea of liberty was born, the freedom to live, speak, and think without fear. These were the thoughts that would soon erupt into revolution. In France, these ideas spread like wildfire. The country's social structure mirrored the same cruel hierarchy, nobility and clergy living lavishly, while peasants struggled for crumbs. The church taxed the poor heavily through a religious tax called the tithe, 1/10 of their produce. On top of that, nobles imposed their own tax called the taille. Ironically, these two privileged classes barely paid taxes themselves. The burden of running the entire kingdom fell on the shoulders of those who had nothing. By the mid-1700s, France's economy was in ruins. Decades of wars with Britain had drained the treasury. When King Louis XVI ascended the throne in 1774 at just 20 years old, he inherited a country deep in debt and hungry for change. His finance minister, Jacques Turgot, tried to implement reforms. He believed in a free market, free trade, and no government interference. But his policies, which allowed merchants to hoard grain and manipulate prices, led to massive inflation and food shortages. Bread, the lifeline of the poor, became a luxury. People rioted in what came to be known as the Flour War. Turgot's next move was even more radical. He suggested taxing the nobility and clergy. That was his end. He was removed in 1776. Ironically, that was the same year the American Revolution succeeded, with France's secret support. France had funded the Americans in their fight against Britain, not for freedom's sake, but to hurt its rival. The result, more debt. France owed billions. And yet, while commoners starved, King Louis and his queen, Marie Antoinette, lived in unimaginable luxury at the Palace of Versailles. Marie Antoinette became a symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy. Her extravagance was legendary. She ordered hundreds of new dresses each year, built expensive gardens, created personal perfumes, and even had hairstyles so absurd one famously featured a miniature ship on her head. While peasants died of hunger, she was rumored to have said, "Let them eat cake." Though that quote was likely fiction, it captured what people felt, a queen completely detached from reality. The people's anger was boiling over, but anger alone doesn't make a revolution. It needs direction, and that came from the philosophers of the Enlightenment. The poor began to believe that they could change their fate, that kings were not divine, that equality was possible. The slogans of liberty, equality, fraternity echoed across Paris. Desperate to fix the economic crisis, King Louis called a meeting of the Estates General in 1789, a council that hadn't been summoned for 175 years. It included representatives from all three estates, the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. But each estate had just one vote, meaning the two privileged classes could always outvote the people. When the commoners demanded fair representation, the king refused. So they broke away and formed their own government, the National Assembly. When Louis locked them out of the meeting hall, they gathered in a nearby tennis court and took a historic oath, vowing not to disband until France had a new constitution. That moment, known as the tennis court oath, was the true beginning of the French Revolution. Rumors soon spread that the king was planning to attack Paris. On July 14, 1789, enraged Parisians stormed the Bastille prison, a symbol of royal tyranny. They freed the few prisoners there and seized weapons. That day is still celebrated as France's Independence Day. The revolution had officially begun. Across the countryside, peasants revolted. Nobles were attacked, mansions were burned, and tax collectors were thrown out. Fear swept through the ruling class, and many fled the country. By August, the National Assembly had drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, the foundation of modern democracy. It declared that all men are born free and equal, but the king still refused to accept it. Then came the women, thousands of them, tired of hunger and injustice, marched from Paris to Versailles, a 13-kilometer journey in pouring rain. They stormed the palace, demanded bread, and forced Louis to sign the declaration. The king and queen were taken back to Paris as prisoners. At this point, the revolution was unstoppable. France abolished the monarchy and became a republic in 1792. King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were executed by guillotine, their heads falling as thousands cheered. It was supposed to be the dawn of equality, the end of tyranny. But instead, it unleashed something darker. The revolutionaries turned on each other. Factions formed, each claiming to be the true defender of liberty. Maximilien Robespierre, once a hero of the revolution, became its monster. Driven by paranoia, he began executing anyone suspected of supporting the monarchy, even without evidence. Thousands were killed in what became known as the Reign of Terror. The very revolution that promised freedom was now drowning in blood. Finally, Robespierre himself was overthrown and executed, but France was still in chaos. In 1799, a young military genius named Napoleon Bonaparte seized power. He ended the revolution and crowned himself emperor. A new monarch had risen, born from the ashes of a revolution that had begun to destroy monarchy. Irony at its finest, yet Napoleon's rule was different. He was a secular ruler, and under him, the revolutionary ideas of equality, liberty, and secularism spread across Europe. So was the French Revolution a failure on the surface, perhaps? The monarchy returned and rivers of blood were shed. But its spirit, the belief that people have the right to question, to demand justice, to be free, never died. Those ideas traveled beyond France, shaping the modern world. They reached India too. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar was deeply inspired by the revolution's call for equality when drafting our constitution. The words liberty, equality, and fraternity found a permanent home in India's preamble. Every time we speak freely, vote, or dream of a fair world, we live the legacy of the French Revolution. It reminds us that freedom was never handed down, it was fought for. And even though the revolution was stained with violence, it gave birth to democracy, secularism, and the modern idea of human rights. If you've come this far into history, take a second to subscribe, because stories like these deserve to be told, and I promise the next one will shake you even more. The French Revolution shows us that change is never simple. It comes with chaos, mistakes, and sacrifices, but without it, the world would still be chained to kings and blind faith. So the next time you see injustice, remember, it all started with people who dared to think differently. Now tell me in the comments, if you had lived in France in 1789, would you have joined the revolution or stood by the king?